At the end of July 2025, we've got the 1.0 release of Le Mans Ultimate. The release notes are fairly lengthy, and I'm going to show them here. We see a lot of tweaks, tunings, things like that, but nothing about virtual reality. In fact, nothing about general engine efficiency gains or performance improvements. And since this major 1.0 release, we've seen some hot fixes, but nothing actually computer performance related. And that's actually disappointed me. I'm not really interested in single player campaigns. I just want to see improvements made to the engine and our driving experience. All of my VR testing today is with a Pimax Crystal Super, and I've done a first impressions video with it here. But it is some pretty high-end kit, which is why I compared it to the Pimax Crystal Lite in this video. It's weird to see two of me like that. Anyways, Pimax has started a promotion that makes the Crystal Lite even more attractive because you can show proof of purchase for a previous headset and get a discount on a Crystal Lite, which is pretty sweet. And if you reference benchmark with a purchase, it helps me out. Unlike the Crystal Super, the Crystal Lite can do 120 Hertz, and it's a bit easier to run as far as the hardware goes. Going back to LMU and this 1.0 update, there is a black screen bug that's affecting VR users and screen users. The menu is fine and it works and displays properly inside the VR headset, but once I hit the track, my monitor goes black in front of me. This doesn't seem to have a performance impact, but it's not very interesting to look at from an external camera. I've seen other users post about this black screen bug, how it affects even single screen monitors and other experiences. So if you know a solution, post below. To remove the impact of a graphics card bottleneck, I'll be using an RTX 5090. This is from ASUS. It's the Tough OC model. And here's the list of CPUs I'll be testing. I've pushed the 13700K a little harder to 5.4 gigs, and you can find the 14700K for the lowest price I've seen yet. Actually, the pricing on all non-X3D CPUs has decreased compared to the last time I looked at this. The used market for the 5800 X3D is just all over the place, but you can find the 5700 X3D. It has a lower boost clock, but it has all of that L3 cache. So it's still a worthy upgrade for simulators from a Ryzen 5600, which now only goes for 115 bucks. And here's a quick glance at the motherboards and memory configuration. XMP and Expo is applied, as well as some basic overclocking. I've seen some of your requests for me to benchmark an Intel 14900K or get one of the Core Ultra 285, and I'd like to, but not at these prices. I don't care about fanboy allegiances. I'm not here to stroke egos, but at that price, it's 9800 X3D, nothing else. When it comes to graphics configuration, I'm using basically what I have done in previous videos, although here it's shown as triple screen, but this is the same settings for VR. I used 4x MSAA to reduce the shimmering inside the Super, but here are the other sim graphics. It's totally fine if you disagree with how I have this configured. The point is I used the same configuration for all CPUs. Reducing visible vehicles is a great way to reduce CPU load, and we'll see that in the benchmarks coming up. So the benchmark itself is going to be just a WEC AI race. I picked the LaSalle circuit, and we're in the GT3 Lexus, just for giggles, I guess. But it is a full grid, so we have the hypers, the prototypes, and the race will be at 5 p.m. or 8 p.m. For the night bench. I went with 90% difficulty, but you can adjust that as you see fit. The benchmark starts once I skip the formation lap, and we'll start rolling here on the track. I'll send the triple screen footage to the top and we'll look at the benchmark beneath. And we're going to start things off with a simple average CPU frame time bar chart. Over the course of this benchmark, this is the average amount of milliseconds it took the CPU to complete its work. In this example, I'm using the 13700K because I want to understand core scaling. Does having more CPU cores help? When we compare just the performance cores, 8 has a small advantage over 6, but there's a pretty jump up from 4 cores. All of the benchmarking today is at 90 Hertz with the Pimax Super, and so the 11.1 millisecond timeline represents the upper limit that we want all of the frames to be delivered beneath this line. Enabling hyper-threading or E-cores provides basically no advantage. I do not run other apps when I'm benchmarking, Chrome, Discord, MSI Afterburner, none of that's running. So you might get different results in your setup because of those other apps. Now, a frame time bar chart is easy to look at, but it's also misleading. For example, just 6 P-cores has a 9.7 millisecond average, but there's a whole range of values. Actually, the minimum is 5.9 milliseconds and the maximum is 12.3, which means when you take the full range into consideration, we exceed our timeline. So if you only look at the average millisecond, you're going to be misled. This is why I prefer to use a histogram to show the distribution of frame times during the course of the benchmarks. When comparing 8 cores in the filled in orange to the blue line of 6 cores, we can see the advantage. The shape of the distribution looks very similar, but the 8 core is all just moved to the left a little bit more, and that represents better performance. And when we consider how many data points are to the right of our 11.1 millisecond line, we see quite a bit more for the blue 6-core data set. And this directly translates to an FPS that's less than 90. Before we dive into the data, I want to go over the Pimax Play setup a little deeper here because I think it's important and it has repercussions on what the data looks like. First up, I'm not using the latest Pimax Play software because I had these results collected before it launched on the 5th of August. There is a claim of improved CPU performance, and maybe I'll do a benchmark here at the end of the video just to see if that's true. With the headset connected and online, if we go into the general properties, we can actually change from SteamVR to Pimax OpenXR for Le Mans Ultimate. And that's because, as I understand it, the LMU team has already integrated the Open Composite API layering, which allows us to bypass SteamVR. So we don't need to manually put in this DLL file like we do in other titles. All we need to do is select Pimax OpenXR or Oculus OpenXR or Virtual Desktop XR, depending on your headset. And then when we go and we launch Le Mans Ultimate and we click on launch it in SteamVR, it's not actually going to open SteamVR, which is great because SteamVR has some of its own issues. It can have bad updates. It can cause bugs. It also can have that overhead where it can detract from the performance we want from our simulators. For example, with a 9800 X3D using this same benchmark, at the top in purple, we see Pimax OpenXR. The data is collected from the OpenXR toolkit, and I'm comparing that to SteamVR with the Pimax Super using, again, the OpenXR toolkit, and we see an increase in the average CPU frame time. And then at the bottom, it's FPS VR data. So this is a different application used to collect the data with better data granularity, and in this case is showing an even higher CPU utilization when running SteamVR. And if we increase CPU load, say by running it at night with all the headlights, and yep, the overhead from SteamVR has a greater impact. This also means if you're already up against a CPU limitation and you're using SteamVR, it's probably contributing to your problems. Unless I state otherwise, the rest of the benchmarks we'll see will be from the OpenXR toolkit and its data output. I'm going to be running Pimax OpenXR, not SteamVR, and the end of the benchmark is right when I get to the end of the Rolex green wall. That's when I stop the benchmark right there. So the next thing I wanted to look at was resolution scaling. What happens as we change the Pimax Play resolution? The presets in the software are low, medium, high, shown here as 0.5, 0.75, and 1.0. Someone corrected me that 1.0 is not the native resolution because the headset goes beyond that through the software. This is true, however, we're talking massive resolutions here. For example, if we compare 1.0 Pimax resolution to the other standard resolutions of a monitor, 1080p, 1440p, and 4K, it would look like this. Anyways, when we look at 1.0 in the frame time chart here, we can see that it spikes quite significantly right before the timeline. This is an artifact of using OpenXR toolkit to collect the data. Unfortunately, we just lose some data granularity when we get that close to the line. We don't want to be there, so that's why I backed it off to 0.9. The more interesting question is, what happens to the CPU frame times? And the answer is not much. Yes, there's slightly more impact as the resolution increases, but not nearly to the extent that you might think. The 9800 X3D has no problem dishing out a heftier workload to the 5090. So I thought, okay, I need to double check this. Let's look at the 13700K. And yeah, we see a very similar result where the CPU is not impacted more by increasing the render resolution. And in this example, the 13700K is actually a bit overwhelmed by having all the cars drawn in this benchmark. And we can visually see this because we have data points to the right of our 11.1 millisecond line actually for each resolution, which also means decreasing the resolution is not going to gain you performance when you are CPU bottlenecked. The resolution it's going to directly affect the graphics card. And when we look at the GPU histogram using the 13700K and the 5090, we can see that. With a faster CPU, the 5090 could deliver better performance. And we saw that with the 9800X 3D. In the histogram data, we also see that anomaly again right around the timeline when a lot of data points clump up there with OpenXR Toolkit. And when we look at how many data points are to the right of our timeline, there's actually a lot. I don't have a fancy chart for this. I'll just use it right out of the spreadsheet. And what we're seeing here is how many frames, what percentage of frames, shown here as a whole number, were delivered on time for the GPU and the CPU. What's strange about this is the, I guess, overreaction by the 5090 to those late frames from the 13700K. The OpenXR Toolkit data suggests the CPU was late by a couple percent each benchmark run, but the GPU was, up to 29% late. This is a trend that I saw throughout all the CPUs and the other testing we'll go through. When the CPU is late, there's a greater knock-on effect to the GPU. You know, looking at all this in hindsight, I'm wondering if it's the fixed foveated rendering that I've applied. While that can relieve the GPU, it also puts more burden on the CPU, so I might have made things worse. But a lot of us use that feature, so maybe it's fine for this testing. Okay, one more thing before the main benchmarks, and that's what's the difference between replays, multiplayer, and an AI race? Because I know someone's going to ask this question. Playing up top is a replay from a GT3 fixed series at Bahrain. I started middle of the pack, and you'll see the incidents ahead. But anyway, it's a decent benchmark that is representative of, I think, the average online experience. My license is not high enough to do the multi-class stuff yet. This is just my fourth online race in LMU. And with a 20-car grid, the performance is pretty similar. The AI race was probably more difficult because on the CPU because the cars are just running closer together, and you'll see me get punted up ahead, which is why some of the field gets spaced out. He did apologize at the end of the race. In fact, he even let me rejoin the race first. I mean, what a gentleman. Meanwhile, the GPU performance was very similar, and this was again at the settings you see on the right-hand side, and I had to adjust the scale for this chart because we peaked, right next to the timeline. Recently, there's been a lot of comparisons with iRacing because LMU is at 1.0, and one of the things I noticed as far as VR performance goes is that there's just, wow, there are just cars everywhere. I forgot. Where was I? Right. Okay. So in the histogram chart, you can see data points for LMU going past that 11.1 millisecond line. And when that happens, I didn't notice stutters in the headset. There weren't those hiccups that we see in iRacing. It felt like the tracking of my head movement was still pretty smooth. During the multiplayer race, I didn't notice any issues. In upcoming examples with significantly reduced FPS, yes, the trackside objects and the opponent's cars are going at a slower FPS, but it's not nearly as bad as what it would look like in iRacing. Okay, with all of this newfound knowledge, let's restart the benchmark, and this time we're looking at just 12 visible cars. So we do have a couple dozen more prototypes and hypers in front of our GT3 class, but we can't see them. This is one of the best ways to decrease the load on your CPU and have a smooth race, especially at the race start. And my benchmarks are always just the first lap of a race because that's the most intense. As usual, we'll send it to the top. We'll look at the results beneath. Our 8 processors are color coordinated, both with the histogram chart and the frame time chart in the top right. The 9800X 3D, to no one's surprise, leads the chart with outstanding performance. It's a generational leap over the 7800X 3D, which we see in green next to it. Next is the Ryzen 5800X 3D, and it actually ties, essentially, the 13700K, which I have overclocked to 5.4 gigs. And we see another close battle between the 12600K and the 7600X. As I showed previously with the core scaling, this isn't about stepping down to two 6-core processors. The gap between the 13700K and the 12600K is generational. It's the architecture improvements that are offered by the newer chip. So if I had a Ryzen 7700X, which is the 8-core variant, it's not going to perform that much faster than the 7600X because it doesn't have the X3D cache like we find on the 5800 or the 7800X 3D. Meanwhile, it's not a very good showing for the Ryzen 5600, which is the budget-friendly, gamer's darling CPU out there because it's very inexpensive. However, simulators are CPU bound a lot of the time. There's way more computation going on here compared to AAA games that rely on the graphics card to do all the heavy lifting. Add in the complexity of a high-end VR headset like the Pimax Crystal Super, and yeah, it's just not going to work well. And then last on the chart is the Intel 10600K, a legacy processor that I've just thrown in there for a reference point. Now let's switch over to the GPU histogram, and we're seeing how the 5090 performs with each of these CPUs. We know from the red 9800X 3D that on-time performance is possible from the 5090, but as we slow the processor down, we get closer and closer to the 11.1 millisecond line and then eventually slipping past it. And that's actually why we see the 12600K outperform the 7600X. They have similar CPU frame time distribution, but the Ryzen processor struggles more with the 5090. Unlike a simulator like iRacing, where we have NVIDIA SPS or iRacing's quad view called MVP, we don't have that advantage here with LMU. So the CPU is instructing a separate render scene for both the left and the right eye. And maybe Intel 12th Gen has an advantage here over the Ryzen 7000 series. Okay, so now let's increase the intensity. We're gonna draw all cars, and we can we can see it here, all the hypers down there, all of the LMP2s. So this is gonna be way harder for the CPUs to handle, especially because my car is last on the grid, so everybody's in front. And when we look at the CPU histogram, this is what we see for the performance results. And this time I have the average FPS in the top right with the GPU on-time delivery percentage. With this very difficult benchmark, only the 9800X 3D in red and the 7800X 3D in green can pull it off with flawless or near flawless performance. The 5800X 3D has a good showing, outpacing the 13700K with all cars visible. But it was also struggling, and it had some late frames that led to the 5090 also being late. Unfortunately, the entry tier CPUs like the 7600X on AM5 platform were struggling big time here. What is an otherwise competent CPU in other gaming scenarios or on a single screen, it's just not cutting it for a high-end VR setup. And you know what? I'm gonna go full screen here because I wanna show you this really dramatic scene. This is very difficult on the CPU because we have a series of left, right, lefts coming up here, and you can just see how many cars are drawn in the distance, swooping around, and that is so difficult on the processor. It has to tell both the left and the right screen what to display and rapidly, and it just falls behind so quickly. A CPU like the Ryzen 5600, man, it doesn't even stand a chance with this kind of render workload. When we look at the GPU histogram showing our 5090 performance, we shouldn't be surprised of these long trails leading out past the 11.1 millisecond line, because if the CPU late, how can GPU be fast? And once again, we've got that collection of data points right before the 11.1 millisecond line, which is representing on-time performance, but we're right on that threshold, and the OpenXR toolkit doesn't quite have the data granularity to show that in a more interesting way. So now let's really just push it to the limit. Let's flick the switch, turn off the lights, and see what happens. I've skipped ahead to the start of the race, but the formation lap, or at least the short formation lap, is part of the benchmark. Originally, I was going to make this, a 12 car visible benchmark, but I thought, you know what, let's just render all of the cars. Let's make this a torture test. The settings.json file within the LMU directory says that only 20 sets of headlights are drawn. It's hard to tell actually within this footage because they get that view distance, but the bigger impact is, well, all of those lights, all of the track lights apparently. The performance impact of this night race is actually so terrible, it reminds me of Automobilista 2, which I believe was this video. It seems like the complexity of this type of lighting is just not conducive with these older render engines like in iRacing and in LMU, which, DirectX 11, we're going back quite a ways here. Not even the 9800X 3D can really hold on, although it's doing a much better job than the rest of the rainbow spaghetti processors we have going on here. And yes, if you see the 5600, the Intel 10600K, I did drive VR at 30 FPS with no motion smoothing or anything to help. All of these results are a single benchmark run. It wasn't very comfortable to do. If you were looking forward to some rain results, unfortunately, I've come up short on that. It took about 50 hours, guys, to set all this up, to collect all the data, process it, make the video, all that. So I'm spent. But if you want to support me and my madness, if you want to see more results like this, please support my channel. You can do the one-time thing through a YouTube super thanks or buy me a coffee. You can become a patron, or if you want help building a computer or need technical advice, just flip me an email. But that's it for now. Ciao.
Thank you.